Human smuggling to Canada is under the microscope. The Harper government is said to be moving ahead with plans to introduce measures to deter human smugglers from setting a course for Canada. According to the Canadian press, the government will table proposed changes to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that would create a new class of asylum seeker called the mass arrival. The proposed new designation would subject certain asylum seekers to tough new detention rules. For more on this story, we are joined by Canadian immigration lawyer Max Berger. Good afternoon, Mr. Berger.
Good afternoon.
Can you tell us about some of the proposed changes you've been hearing about?
Well, the government is sending out a message here to would-be asylum seekers, and the message is don't get on the boat to come to Canada because the rough ride will really begin once you get here. And that's a message that's not compatible with our international obligations in the area of refugee law. It seems that the government is set to create two streams of asylum seekers. The first for what they deem to be mass arrivals, which really means those people that come here by boat, and the second for all other refugees. So the question is, are these new rules really necessary? I would say that the government has manufactured a crisis over the last 6 weeks in its handling of the 500 BC Tamils, and these new measures are in response to a crisis of the government's own creation. Let's put it into perspective. We see on average 35,000 asylum seekers coming to Canada every year. The 500 who arrived in BC last month represent less than 2% of that annual flow. Yet all of those 500 have been detained, whereas of the 34,000 who arrive every year, a very small percentage are detained. When it comes to Tamils, we see every year hundreds of Tamils making asylum claims in Canada, and some years it's as high as 2,000. Those Tamils, they all arrive with the same kind of identity documents as the BC Tamils, namely birth certificate, their Sri Lankan identity card. And the Tamils that arrive by conventional means are rarely detained. So before we ask whether these tough new rules for detention are necessary, we have to ask whether the detentions themselves are justified just because these people came here by boat.
What about, though, Mr. Berger, the concern that there may be terrorists hidden among these legitimate asylum seekers?
Well, again, this is part of the hysteria, I might say, that the government is creating. It was the same story last October with respect to the 76 Tamils that arrived in BC. Now, 11 months later, there's been no evidence of any terrorists. Same with these new arrivals. There were rumors created by the government of tuberculosis on board, of terrorists on board, and so far not a shred of evidence to support either allegation.
One of the proposed changes, if I'm not mistaken, was that if someone was to arrive as a mass refugee claimant, instead of the rules, which right now say that they should be held for 48 hours and processed within 48 hours, now the proposed new rules say they could be held for 2 weeks and then processed. What kind of hardship would this impose upon travelers who have already spent, relatively awful, spent their time in relatively awful conditions making their way to Canada?
Practically, it's not going to make much difference because if you look at the BC Tamils, most or many of those had their detention reviews in the current stipulated 48 hours, and all of them certainly within the first week. And yet 6 weeks later, they are still all detained, except for just a few where detention orders were made. So practically speaking, having the detention review after 2 weeks is not going to make that much difference if the government still wants to see them detained. What this is more, it's a symbolic message that the government is sending so that people will not come here by this method.
Because Canada does have a reputation, an international reputation, on having quite open borders and an open immigration policy. Would you agree with that?
We have a very fair immigration policy. We give our refugee claimants a very fair hearing. They have appeals, and our reputation in the international community with respect to refugee protection is very good. And we should not let this government sully that reputation.
But the government doesn't want Canada's reputation to be deemed as soft either.
Well, again, I get back to these 500 boat people, if you will, they represent only 2% of the annual flow of refugees. So it is not such a major crisis that requires a new piece of legislation.
Max Berger, appreciate your insight as always. Thank you.
Thank
Max
you.
Berger is a Canadian immigration lawyer.